The Sd.Kfz 251 edged down a blasted street, its tracks grinding over broken masonry as if feeling for the ground beneath. Moments later, the crew inside called it by the name everyone used, the Hanomag. Under fire, it acted less like a standard transport and more like a piece of equipment built to tolerate conditions that punished everything else. Infantry gripped the benches as the Maybach engine fought heat, dust, and the sharp echo of nearby impacts. It moved without finesse, but with a persistence that carried men through places tires simply couldn't. For a few seconds, that was enough to stay alive. In the early campaigns of the Second World War, German infantry often found themselves moving faster on paper than their boots could carry them across real terrain. The growing reliance on rapid, coordinated assaults revealed a burden at the heart of German doctrine. Tanks could push forward at speed, but the foot soldiers meant to secure the ground arrived exhausted, exposed, or late. It was not a tactical oversight. It was a structural gap in mobility. The need was simple to articulate, but difficult to fulfill. Soldiers had to keep pace with armoured spearheads while still being protected from small arms fire and shrapnel, and they needed to dismount close enough to the fighting to remain relevant. Trucks offered speed, but no protection. Armoured cars offered protection, but not the capacity to carry a meaningful number of men. The gap between armour and infantry widened with every kilometre advanced. Here, the Hanomag earned its place, not through glamour, but through function. Its half-track layout gave it the weight distribution to manage soft ground without sinking like a truck, while its armoured body gave it just enough protection to mitigate the chaos of artillery splinters and small arms bursts. The vehicle was not trying to be a tank. It was trying to be a moving foothold. The engineering problem began with the chassis. Germany had experience producing half-tracks for towing artillery, and these designs provided a foundation: angled armour for deflection, interleaved wheels for stability, and a track length proportioned for harsh surfaces. Designers realized that a troop carrier built on this kind of platform could deliver infantry directly into contested zones without exhausting them along the way. This wasn't ambition. It was designing around the realities of broken roads and overburdened marches. One notable insight came from the way the suspension distributed weight along the tracks. By reducing ground pressure, the Hanomag could keep moving in locations where traditional wheeled vehicles bogged down. Another came from the interior layout. Benches positioned along the hull allowed soldiers to exit quickly, a detail driven not by comfort, but by the need to avoid bunching under fire. A third was the open-top design, which reduced manufacturing weight and allowed crew members better situational awareness, at the cost of vulnerability overhead. All of this was developed under the strain of wartime production, where resources were often allocated to more glamorous machines. Engineers were tasked with creating something resilient without demanding exotic steels or too many machining hours. It was the sort of assignment where a design department knew they'd be blamed if it failed, yet quietly forgotten if it worked. The goal wasn't brilliance, it was reliability under strain. By the time the Hanomag entered wider service, it filled a role that had previously been patched together with improvisation. Armoured formations finally had a way to carry infantry that didn't undermine the pace of operations soldiers could advance with tanks rather than miles behind them, and mounted units could shelter during the approach instead of scattering for cover with every burst of fire. The weight of operational mobility had shifted. Germany now had a machine that carried part of that burden across mud, rubble, and broken fields, and it did so with a practicality that proved essential to the doctrine it supported. The concept behind the Hanomag did not emerge from a single meeting or declaration. It surfaced gradually, shaped by officers who watched infantry fall behind and engineers who understood what machines could and could not endure. The Army High Command saw the need for a vehicle that could accompany armour without becoming a burden on it, a transport that could cross the same ruined landscapes as tanks, yet remain lightweight enough to be built in significant numbers. In the quiet corners of staff papers, the outline began to form. This vision centred on a simple observation. Mobility was inseparable from protection. Infantry left behind by the advance were not just slower, they were more vulnerable. Those caught on open roads or struggling through mud became casualties long before reaching the main fight. A protected carrier could close that gap, preserving strength while maintaining operational tempo. The principle was not unique to Germany, but the interpretation would be distinct. Engineers working on early prototypes began with doctrine rather than blueprints. The vehicle had to deliver a squad into battle intact. It had to traverse ground that punished wheels. It had to be affordable enough not to starve tank production. These three pillars produced the foundation from which the Hanomag's shape emerged. The angled side armour, sloped to deflect glancing rounds, reflected lessons from armoured car design. The extended track run came from artillery prime movers. And the open top, controversial at first, was a concession to weight, simplicity, and situational awareness. One of the defining technical principles was the distribution of effort. Instead of trying to armour the vehicle to withstand heavy weapons, designers prioritised creating a machine that kept moving after minor hits. A track guard might bend, a fender might crumple, a wheel station might suffer. But as long as the machine continued forward, it fulfilled its purpose. This philosophy contrasted with the more rigid protection concepts of the time, which favoured thick armour at the expense of mobility. A second key insight lay in the drive system. The half-track configuration allowed for a powered front axle combined with tracked propulsion at the rear, enabling sharper steering compared to full-track machines. This reduced the turning radius, made the vehicle more responsive at low speeds, and simplified training for conscripts familiar only with civilian lorries. It also allowed for better control on uneven ground, where a fully tracked design might slide or bite unpredictably. A third insight came from the compartmentalization of components. Designers separated critical mechanical elements, such as the transmission and radiator, to allow quick field access without stripping extensive armour panels. This decision was born from necessity. A machine deployed across vast distances had to be repairable with limited tools and limited time. As the concept matured, competing ideas surfaced. Some argued for a fully enclosed troop space to protect from overhead fire. Others wanted a lighter vehicle with thinner armour to maximise numbers. What emerged was a compromise between ideal and possible. The Hanomag became the embodiment of a wartime balancing act, protection balanced against weight, mobility against durability, and production practicality against tactical ambition. It was, in truth, the kind of vehicle that emerged when theory was politely asked to make room for reality. The design was neither adventurous nor indulgent. It was purposeful, shaped by the understanding that the battlefield punished extravagance as swiftly as it punished hesitation. The vision was now clear, a vehicle built not for show, but for the continuous grinding demands of mobile warfare. With doctrine aligned and principles defined, the task of building it would fall to the factories and workshops already strained by the pace of war. The factories tasked with constructing the Hanomag were already operating under conditions that would challenge any design team. Steel allocations shifted weekly, labour shortages pulled skilled hands from production lines, and air raids routinely disrupted schedules. Yet the vehicle's manufacturing demands were deliberately modest: angled plates, straightforward weld lines, and a chassis derived from existing half-track experience. In an environment where complexity often meant delay, simplicity became a virtue. Assembly began with the frame. The chassis, adapted from artillery prime movers, was laid out on jigs that held its proportions with careful precision. From there, the interleaved road wheels were positioned along the torsion bar suspension. This configuration, though occasionally troublesome in mud, was chosen for its ability to distribute shocks evenly and maintain stability under load. It gave the Hanomag a steadiness that surprised crews who expected harsher movement from a semi-tracked vehicle. The engine, a Maybach HL42, was installed next not a powerhouse, but reliable within its tolerances. Its carburettor demanded clean fuel, its cooling system needed unobstructed airflow, and its power curve suited the slow, determined acceleration expected of a troop carrier. Mechanics learned quickly that the engine responded best when not asked for miracles. Steady throttle, careful temperature management, and regular lubrication kept it in the fight. This was a machine that rewarded diligence more than daring. Then came the armour. Each plate was angled to improve survivability without increasing thickness. Welders worked in narrow booths, often under blackout conditions, fusing seams that needed to withstand vibration, recoil, and the occasional glancing round. The roofless troop compartment was both a design decision and a manufacturing relief. Fewer surfaces meant fewer welds, fewer bottlenecks, and less structural weight. The open top, while exposing the crew to overhead threats, allowed rapid access to interior components, an important consideration for field maintenance. The interior layout followed rules of efficiency rather than comfort. Benches were bolted directly to the hull sides. Storage racks and mounting points were placed where they could be reached quickly, not where they avoided bruised elbows. The radio mount sat close to the commander's position, wiring routed through reinforced channels to protect it from vibration. Every decision was dictated by what the vehicle needed to accomplish, not by how pleasant the ride might be. A critical innovation came in the track assembly process. Instead of hand-fitting each link, a time-consuming procedure, specific jigs were developed to streamline alignment. This reduced manufacturing hours and improved consistency. Another innovation lay in the modularity of components. Transmissions, final drives, and even armour panels could be swapped with relative ease, minimizing downtime during repairs. And a third innovation appeared in the simplified steering linkage, which allowed the front wheels to guide the tracks without requiring excessive driver strength. A necessary adaptation given the varied experience of conscripted drivers. Setbacks were frequent. Materials arrived late. Casting flaws appeared in batches of wheels. Factories suffered outages. Yet the design's practicality allowed production to continue with improvisation rather than redesign. It was the kind of machine that tolerated a certain amount of industrial chaos without taking it personally. This resilience in manufacturing translated directly onto the battlefield, a straightforward design made for predictable behavior. By the time completed vehicles rolled out of the factories, the Hanomag had become more than an idea. It was a manufactured reality, shaped by constraints yet defined by purpose. What remained was to prove whether this straightforward assembly of steel, tracks, and determination could withstand the ceaseless pressures of war. A new Hanomag rolled onto its first trial ground with the restrained uncertainty of a machine still deciding what it wanted to be. Engineers watched from clipboards and makeshift shelters, while drivers coaxed it over trenches, mounds, and track-defying gradients. The initial question wasn't whether it could fight, but whether it could endure the ordinary inconveniences of war: mud, dust, misaligned parts, and the inevitable mishandling by inexperienced crews. On hard ground, the steering proved responsive. The combination of front-wheel guidance and rear-track propulsion gave the driver surprising control in low-speed turns. The turning radius was tighter than expected for a vehicle of its length, a notable advantage in urban streets where rubble forced frequent course changes. Yet test notes also recorded the drawbacks. At higher speeds, steering demanded caution, as the tracks could dig in aggressively if provoked. Soft terrain told another story. The long track run distributed weight effectively, keeping the vehicle from sinking into marshy fields. Its ability to maintain forward momentum over disrupted earth was consistently documented, less dramatic than a tank charging ahead, but steady, predictable, and tactically reliable. Observers noted how the front wheels floated lightly across dips before the tracks asserted grip. It was this blend of wheel and track behaviour that allowed the Hanomag to perform in areas where purely wheeled transports faltered. A key insight emerged from braking trials. The semi-tracked configuration created uneven feedback through the chassis under abrupt stops. Engineers experimented with brake balance refinements, adjusting cable tension and drum size to stabilize the vehicle's deceleration. Troop safety hinged on predictability, and test crews documented how sudden braking could throw soldiers forward unless instructions emphasized proper seating and grip. Then came reliability tests. The Maybach engine was run to temperature, cooled, run again, and placed under progressively heavier loads. Mechanics monitored oil breakdown, thermal cycling effects on gaskets, and carburetor tuning in varying conditions. While the engine lacked raw power, it demonstrated consistency within the parameters expected of a utility machine. It demanded respect, clean fuel, careful warm-up, and regular maintenance. But within those boundaries, it worked without complaint. Further trials examined armour integrity. The angled plates deflected small arms fire as intended, though blunt impacts caused ringing vibrations that unsettled early crews. The open roof, while tactically useful for observation and weapons fire, left troops vulnerable to descending shrapnel, a trade noted repeatedly in test documents. Efforts to add lightweight shielding were explored, but rejected due to weight and production concerns. Another important observation came from dismount tests. Soldiers exited quickly when benches were positioned correctly, but in early models, protruding mounts slowed movement. Adjustments streamlined the troop compartment, reducing snag points and improving evacuation times, a vital refinement given the chaos of frontline operations. One engineer allegedly remarked that the Hanomag behaved like a student who passed every exam but looked unimpressed by the achievement. It performed as designed, without flair, without complaint, and without any illusions of grandeur. The trials didn't reveal a miracle machine. They revealed a dependable one. And with the evaluations complete, the Hanomag moved from proving ground to battlefield, where its real examination would begin under far harsher scrutiny. When the Hanomag entered widespread service, it did so without ceremony. It was not presented as a wonder weapon, nor as the answer to sweeping strategic challenges. It was simply expected to function. And on the battlefield, it performed as intended, delivering infantry, supporting armour, and surviving conditions that defeated more delicate vehicles. Yet this practical success carried with it a series of unintended consequences that revealed both the strengths and the limits of the design. Its breakthrough quality was operational cohesion. For the first time, mechanised infantry could reliably keep pace with tank units across extended advances. Photographic reports from France, the Eastern Front, and the Balkans show Hanomags moving in tight columns, maintaining formation over torn fields and broken roads. This gave armoured commanders the ability to launch coordinated assaults with fewer delays, reducing the hours infantry spent exposed in forced marches. In offensive operations, the vehicle helped close the gap between planning and execution. However, visual documentation from occupied cities tells a different story. Narrow streets, improvised barricades, and close quarters fighting exposed vulnerabilities inherent to the open roof. Shrapnel, grenades, and angled small arms fire dropped into the troop compartment with alarming ease. Crews adapted by adding makeshift shielding, spare track links, tarpaulins, even wooden planks, but these modifications provided limited protection. In these environments, the Hanomag's strength as a battlefield taxi became a liability, complicating its use in dense urban fighting. A second limitation surfaced in winter operations. The interleaved wheel system, so stable in trials, became difficult to maintain in freezing conditions. Snow packed between the wheels, ice built up around suspension arms, and mobility degraded sharply if maintenance routines slipped even slightly. Field workshops documented cases where frozen mud immobilized the suspension until crews spent hours freeing it by hand. This was not a failure of design so much as a reminder of its sensitivity to the climate extremes of the Eastern Front. A third consequence emerged in logistical planning. The Hanomag required disciplined fuel use to maintain pace with tanks, consuming more petrol than trucks, but carrying fewer personnel. Over time, this created an operational tension. Commanders valued the vehicle's protection and mobility, but supply officers struggled to allocate sufficient fuel for large mechanised infantry formations. In prolonged operations, some units resorted to mixed columns, Hanomags in front, trucks behind, creating coordination issues when terrain suddenly deteriorated. Despite these challenges, battlefield reports still documented clear advantages. The ability to redeploy troops under fire saved lives. Mobility across difficult terrain prevented units from falling behind during rapid shifts in the front line, and the confidence among infantry, knowing they could reach positions with some measure of protection, improved unit cohesion, even if the vehicle itself was far from invulnerable. One officer dryly remarked that the Hanomag wasn't perfect, but it was preferable to running, a comment reflecting both its strengths and its constraints. It succeeded because it met a specific operational need, not because it transcended its limitations. Ultimately, the Hanomag's performance was neither triumph nor failure. It was a practical response to the operational demands of mobile warfare. Its impact lay not in exceptionalism, but in enabling a new rhythm of movement, one that shaped how armies maneuvered across some of the most unforgiving landscapes of the war. As the Hanomag spread across multiple theatres, its effect extended beyond movement on a battlefield. It shaped logistics, propaganda, morale, and even the enemy's response to mechanised warfare. None of these influences were intentional. They emerged gradually, scraps in reports, marginalia in diaries, footnotes in intelligence summaries. Yet taken together, they revealed a deeper consequence of introducing a reliable armoured carrier into a conflict already strained by scale. Economically, the Hanomag placed pressure where wartime Germany was already stretched: fuel. Mechanised infantry formations required not just petrol, but a steady stream of spare parts, road wheels, track links, brake drums, and ignition components. As production increased, so too did the strain on supply dumps already prioritising tank repairs. Fuel convoys documented the challenge most vividly. Columns routed to armoured units suddenly had to divert precious litres to keep troop carriers operational. This reshaping of supply priorities was not catastrophic, but it forced repeated recalibrations in resource planning. Another unintended consequence lay in the effect the Hanomag had on occupied populations. Its appearance in towns and villages, half-track growling, armour plates angled, rifle barrels visible, projected an image of organised mechanisation, even when the reality behind the front was fracturing. Civilian accounts noted the psychological impact, not admiration but apprehension. The vehicle's silhouette, broad and angular, became associated with troop movements, raids, and forced relocations. These impressions hardened resistance movements in some regions, confirming that mechanized troops could arrive quickly and in numbers. Propaganda ministries also seized upon the Hanomag's profile. Photographs of advancing mechanized columns appeared in pamphlets and newsreels designed to demonstrate control and mobility. Yet these images inadvertently misled internal planners. The vehicle's presence in propaganda created an impression of ubiquity that did not align with production numbers. Some divisions were shown with more Hanomags on film than they possessed in reality, creating logistical expectations that factories could not meet. In this way, imagery outpaced industry. A major hidden consequence surfaced in Allied intelligence assessments. Captured vehicles, technical drawings and field reports led analysts to conclude that Germany was prioritizing mobile infantry support to a degree that exceeded the truth. Allied planners anticipated larger mechanized formations and adjusted estimates accordingly, sometimes overestimating enemy mobility in regions where Hanomag numbers were minimal. This misinterpretation influenced operational decisions, occasionally prompting caution where none was strictly necessary. On the battlefield, the vehicle also shifted tactical expectations. Units equipped with Hanomags began to rely on being transported under armour, which subtly altered training and doctrine. Infantry accustomed to arriving fresh and sheltered found that dismounted movement over extended distances became more challenging than before. Conversely, units without the vehicle recognized the disparity and pressed for equipment they were unlikely to receive. The machine, by its mere presence, created a divide in experience within the same army. A final consequence came from maintenance culture. Workshops that managed the Hanomag developed habits centered on modular repairs, standardized component swaps, and routine servicing that bordered on ritual. When post-war armies absorbed these practices, they discovered that the underlying logic, keep vehicles simple, keep parts interchangeable, keep repairs quick, translated easily to peacetime fleets. The Hanomag indirectly shaped a strand of post-war military engineering through the expectations it created. One maintenance officer quipped that the Hanomag didn't change the war, but it changed how we organized the shelves, a remark that captured the subtlety of its influence. It was not the most powerful or the most feared machine of its era, but it carried with it a series of ripples, logistical, psychological, bureaucratic, that extended far beyond its armoured frame. These were the consequences no design committee planned, but which inevitably followed the introduction of a machine built for movement in a war defined by scale. The end of the war scattered Hanomags across continents, leaving them abandoned on verges, half buried in fields, or sitting quietly beside roads where retreating columns had once stretched for miles. Their metal frames, once part of coordinated advances, became markers of routes taken and routes lost. In the immediate post-war years, they were little more than salvage, steel, rubber, and components to be recycled for rebuilding shattered economies. Yet, even in their stillness, they signalled lessons that would influence military engineering well beyond their original purpose. The first legacy was doctrinal armies. Studying the conflict saw that mobility and infantry protection could not be treated separately. The ability to move troops under armour had shaped operations across multiple fronts. This principle informed the development of post-war armoured personnel carriers, which adopted fully enclosed designs, improved protection, and engines tuned for higher speeds. The Hanomag was not their blueprint, but it demonstrated the value of combining transport, protection, and cross-country mobility in a single platform. A second legacy emerged during the reconstruction of European militaries. Engineers and planners prioritized modular mechanical systems, engines accessible without extensive disassembly, transmissions that could be swapped in the field, and track assemblies built from standardized parts. These concepts, present in the Hanomag's design, resonated with nations rebuilding under resource constraints. Vehicles like the British FV series, the American M75 and M113, and early Warsaw Pact carriers all benefited indirectly from this emphasis on ease of production and maintenance. A third legacy took shape in training and logistics. The wartime use of half-track carriers highlighted the importance of driver instruction, routine servicing, and the integration of support vehicles into combat planning. Post-war manuals for armoured personnel carriers emphasized these lessons. Clear maintenance intervals, simplified operating procedures, and the notion that mobility could only be sustained if crews understood the mechanical limits of their machines. These ideas did not originate with the Hanomag alone, but the vehicle provided a widely studied case during the transition into Cold War mechanization. The visual legacy was different. Photographs of the Hanomag, rows of angular hulls, dust clouds trailing behind columns, infantry poised at the edges of open compartments, became part of the broader narrative of mechanized warfare. Museums, training schools, and historical archives preserved images not for celebration, but for analysis. They showed the transition from foot-bound formations to mobile forces, illustrating the mixed protection and vulnerability that defined early armoured carriers. Its mechanical features also left an imprint. The half-track layout, though eventually overshadowed by fully tracked carriers, persisted in specialized roles. Engineering vehicles, recovery platforms, and some artillery tractors continued to use hybrid wheel-track systems where their unique traction advantages remained valuable. The Hanomag helped demonstrate both the strengths and inherent limitations of this configuration, shaping later decisions about when and where half-tracks were appropriate. One post-war engineer summarized it with characteristic understatement. It taught us what to keep and what never to repeat. The open roof, the maintenance-heavy wheel system, the limited armour, these were phased out. But the emphasis on mobility, simplicity, and cross-country resilience endured. By the 1950s and 1960s, new generations of armoured personnel carriers had evolved far beyond the Hanomag's abilities. Yet the conceptual thread remained visible, a machine built to bring infantry forward safely, reliably, and at the tempo demanded by modern conflict. The Hanomag had not defined the future, but it had helped set its direction. Across the surviving photographs, the Hanomag appears in motion more often than at rest, a vehicle pushing through dust, edging along muddy verges, or carrying infantry toward a line they could not yet see. Movement defined it. Slow, deliberate, mechanical movement that outlasted tires, weather, and terrain. It was not a symbol of power, but of continuity, the practical bridge between positions, decisions, and moments that otherwise would have remained disconnected. Returning to that blasted street from the beginning, the Hanomag's presence becomes easier to interpret. It was never intended as a frontline spectacle. It was designed for the unspectacular work of getting people from one point to another under circumstances designed to prevent exactly that. The ground it crossed, fields, rubble, snow, broken roads, shaped its reputation more than any technical brochure ever could. In the end, the machine reflected the demands placed upon it. Harsh, repetitive, and unrelenting. Its technical characteristics reveal the philosophy behind it. The semi-tracked layout, though eventually replaced by fully tracked carriers, demonstrated an enduring principle: distribute weight, gain traction, deny the terrain its usual influence. For engineers studying its legacy, this concept lingered. Post-war vehicles improved upon it by closing the roof, increasing armour, and upgrading engines, but the idea of mobility as a protective measure found its footing partly through machines like the Hanomag. Another layer of understanding comes from its limitations. The vulnerabilities inherent in an open-top design became cautionary markers for future development. Commanders noted how exposure to shrapnel shaped tactical decisions, and designers took note of how maintenance-intensive systems constrained operations during extreme weather. The carrier's shortcomings became guideposts, clear indications of where ambitions must be tempered by practicality and where practicality must be reinforced by innovation. A further reflection lies in the way the machine has been remembered. Its silhouette appears in archives across Europe, not because it dominated battlefields, but because it accompanied events that reshaped entire regions. Liberation photographs often include captured or abandoned examples. Resistance reports mention its sound approaching in the night. Post-war accounts describe them rusting beside roads where they had been left behind. It was woven into the fabric of the conflict, not through prestige, but through ubiquity. The Hanomag's endurance in historical memory is therefore not tied to a claim. It persists because it represented a shift in how armies moved, how infantry survived the journey to their objectives, and how engineering adapted to the brutal practicalities of modern war. Its influence lies not in any single achievement, but in the cumulative effect of thousands of journeys, each one shaped by the same mechanical persistence. A later historian remarked that the Hanomag measured its success in meters gained rather than headlines earned, a sentiment that captures its quiet significance. The machine did not rewrite strategy, but it supported the strategies that were written. It did not transform warfare, but it met warfare's demands with the tools it had, and so its story concludes as it began, a vehicle defined by movement, built to carry burdens, human and mechanical, across landscapes determined to resist them. The Hanomag's legacy endures not through spectacle, but through the undeniable fact that it kept moving when movement mattered most.